Who was Christopher Columbus? Welcome to ColapX, where history comes to life, and each video immerses you in the destiny of those who shaped the world. Today, we embark on a fascinating journey following the epic of Christopher Columbus. In just a few years, this daring navigator transformed the world view by crossing the Atlantic at the helm of a modest fleet, challenging the unknown and paving the way for an era of unprecedented conquests and exchanges. Unwavering perseverance, risky calculations, thirst for glory. His name became synonymous with discovery between triumph and controversy. But beyond the glorified tales, who really was this man convinced he had reached the Indies without ever suspecting the existence of a new world? But before setting off on a new adventure, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and enjoy your journey. At the turn of the 15th century, Europe was experiencing profound upheavals marked both by the end of the Middle Ages and the advent of the Renaissance. It was a time when the works of ancient Greek and Roman authors, long forgotten or hoarded by certain scholarly circles, began to circulate more freely in the great European courts. Scholars, supported by influential patrons, sought to surpass the inherited knowledge of the past. They were interested in astronomy, geometry, medicine, and geography. In major Italian cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa, art and science progressed through the influence of figures like Leonardo da Vinci, who, a bit later, would symbolize this innovative momentum. Universities were developing, and curiosity about new lands, until then unknown or only described through vague accounts, became a subject of passionate debate. It was in this context that the prospect of exploring the Atlantic Ocean took an unexpected turn. Sailors and explorers glimpsed the possibility of bypassing the limits imposed by traditional trade routes and accessing the wealth of Asia by opening new maritime pathways. However, Europe's political situation remained fragmented. Several kingdoms vied for influence over the continent. Among them were France, England, Portugal, Castile, and Aragon. The rivalry between France and England had left scars after the 100 Years' War, which ended in 1453, somewhat weakening both powers. In the Iberian Peninsula, the marriage of the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, sealed the union of their crowns and marked the birth of a major political force, the Spanish monarchy. With this alliance, Castile and Aragon strengthened their military and financial power while consolidating a vast territory that would gradually expand as Spain became a key player in European expansion towards the ocean. At the end of the 15th century, this burgeoning state focused notably on the Reconquista, that is, the effort to oust the last Muslim kingdoms from the Iberian Peninsula, culminating in the capture of Granada in 1492. To truly understand the deep-rooted thirst for exploration, one must emphasize the significant importance of spices in the period's economy. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg held a central place in both medieval and Renaissance diets and medicine. At a time when food preservation techniques were limited, these commodities not only enhanced the flavor of dishes, but also extended the shelf life of certain provisions. Exotic materials like silk also contributed to the splendor of royal courts and to affirming the prestige of the nobility. The primary centers for spice supply were located in Asia, particularly in the Indian Ocean and the Indonesian archipelago, later known as the Spice Islands. Historically, these luxury goods reached Europe by traveling along the Silk Road, a complex network of land and sea routes crossing Central Asia, the Near East, and then the Mediterranean. Since the end of the Middle Ages, Venetian and Genoese merchants have dominated trade in the Mediterranean. They themselves depend on the goodwill of the Ottoman Empire, which, after the capture of Constantinople in 1453, controls a large part of the former Byzantine territories and extends its authority over vast regions of the Levant. The Ottomans impose high taxes and strict regulations on the passage of goods, making spices increasingly expensive for Western Europeans. This situation prompts commercial and maritime powers to bypass these costly intermediaries. The idea of discovering a direct route from Europe to the sources of supply in Asia thus becomes a major strategic project. In royal circles, it is quickly understood that whoever controls this route will dominate an extremely lucrative market. It is within this context that the extraordinary excitement around Atlantic exploration at the end of the 15th century must be understood. Spain and Portugal are ready to finance daring sailors, capable of finding an undiscovered passage to the Indies. At the same time, Portugal, having taken advantage of its Atlantic coastline, sets up long-distance maritime expeditions. Its objective is to secure control of the routes to India by circumnavigating Africa. This quest for a direct maritime route intensifies the competition with Spain. The two Iberian kingdoms wish to cement their naval supremacy, and each hopes to gain an advantage in the race for precious spices. The Portuguese kings, notably under the impetus of Prince Henry the Navigator, have already invested in maritime technological advancements, perfected cartography, and encouraged the construction of better-performing sail ships, such as the caravel. As the 15th century draws to a close, the competition intensifies. Portugal, confident in the route around Africa, and Castile, still hesitant but on the rise politically, closely observe each other's successes and failures. Portugal distinguishes itself by its early mastery of oceanic navigation. Henry the Navigator, a very active Portuguese prince in the first half of the 15th century, does not sail himself as much as his nickname might suggest, but he establishes around him a school of geographers, cartographers, and astronomers. Installed in his residence at Sagres, in the extreme southwest of the Iberian Peninsula, Henry encourages captains and pilots to develop new instruments and theoretical approaches to navigate the Atlantic's capes. This quest for maritime knowledge spans several decades and results in many successes. The discovery of Madeira in 1419, the Azores in 1427, and the methodical progression along the African coasts, eventually crossing feared capes like Cape Bojador, once deemed impenetrable. Gradually, the Portuguese venture further south, establishing forts and trading posts, notably in the Gulf of Guinea region. They engage in trade of gold, ivory, and increasingly, African slaves, thus providing essential resources to the kingdom. When, in 1488, Bartolomeu Dias manages to round Africa's southern tip, called the Cape of Storms, later renamed Cape of Good Hope, Portugal is on the verge of opening a direct maritime route to the Indian Ocean. This feat, which demonstrates the possibility of circumventing the African continent, arouses the envy of other nations, notably the nascent Spanish monarchy. The latter, however, cannot ignore the fierce competition from Lisbon. The Portuguese court views the Atlantic as almost part of its sphere of influence and wants to defend its acquired advantages. Meanwhile, Spain, now endowed with increased resources after the unification of Castile and Aragon and the recapture of Muslim territories, seeks its own path. In this climate, new proposals emerge, such as reaching China and the Spice Islands directly by sailing westward across the Atlantic. This idea is based on the conviction of a spherical Earth and various more or less reliable calculations, inherited among others from Ptolemy, a 2nd century Greek geographer, whose translated and commented works circulate among the literate circles of the time. Indeed, based on the cartography inherited from the ancient world, it is known that the Earth is round. This notion is not unknown to medieval elites, contrary to some popular legends spread later. However, the circumference of the globe is subject to estimates that are sometimes fanciful or minimized. The manuscripts consulted by the scholars of the 15th century, often derived from Arab or Greco-Roman sources, present significant margins of error. Navigators therefore often underestimate the actual distance separating Europe from Asia if they venture westward across the Atlantic. This erroneous vision, paradoxically, gives boldness to some sailors who, otherwise, might have deemed the enterprise impossible. The desire to find a quick maritime route to the Indies and the financial allure of spices ultimately convinced them to undertake the adventure. Thus, those who dare to embark on a journey with no guaranteed return will have, despite this overestimation of their chances of success, the support of powerful monarchs eager to outpace their rivals. To better understand the scale of the task awaiting these explorers, one must look at the situation in the rest of the world at the same time, namely, at the end of the 15th century. The Ottoman Empire, under sultans like Mehmed II, is at the peak of its power. It controls the eastern Mediterranean, most of the Balkans, and dominates the trade routes connecting Asia and Europe. In the shadow of this great empire, other Muslim sultanates and emirates in the Near and Middle East exert considerable cultural and religious influence. The Ottoman Empire proves to be a key player of the time as it holds the main terrestrial gateways to the Asian continent. Further east, the Ming dynasty has ruled China since 1368. In the 15th century, the Middle Kingdom experiences a period of prosperity and cultural expansion. The Ming emperors oversee the rise of the bureaucracy and protect the Great Wall to defend their northern borders. The great maritime expeditions of Admiral Zheng He, which take place between 1405 and 1433, demonstrate China's naval and commercial power. Zheng He organizes immense fleets that sail as far as East Africa, the Indian Ocean, and Arabia, bringing back treasures and establishing diplomatic contacts. However, after this phase of discoveries, China gradually turns inward, favoring the defense of its terrestrial borders and the stabilization of its empire over distant exploration. This gradual withdrawal leaves the field open to European and particularly Portuguese and then Spanish ambitions, who, seizing the opportunity, will establish themselves in the Indian Ocean. In Africa, powerful kingdoms also prosper at the end of the 15th century. The Kingdom of Mali, successor to the Ghana Empire, had once dominated the trans-Saharan routes, rich in gold and salt. Further east, the Songhai Empire is in full growth, controlling Timbuktu and other trading cities located along the Niger River. Through these major urban centers, transits part of the trade connected to Sahara caravans. Gold, the Portuguese navigators sail along the African Atlantic coast precisely to reach these commercial areas without passing through the desert expanses. Thus, the coasts of West Africa find themselves under the pressure of Europeans who wish to establish trading posts, forge relations with local chiefs, and monopolize the trade of precious metals, spices, and even slaves. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the Americas, brilliant civilizations develop entirely independently, unaware of the Europeans of the 15th century. The Aztecs dominate a large territory in present-day Mexico, with Tenochtitlan as their capital. This lake city, founded on a series of islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco, impresses with its monumental temples and bustling markets. The Mayans, settled in the Yucatan Peninsula and surrounding regions, possess a considerable scientific and artistic heritage, marked by knowledge of astronomy, the use of a complex writing system, and the construction of city-states. Further south, the Inca Empire extends its roads along the Andes mountain range, uniting a vast array of peoples under a centralized power. with Cusco as the geographical and cultural heart. Cloth woven from llama fibers, gold ornamentation, and agricultural terrace engineering. All these innovations reflect the inventiveness of Andean societies. Yet, no European ruler knows these empires exist at the time. The 15th century world is immensely divided, and the crucial fact is that entire continents are unaware of each other. It is this mutual ignorance that makes the idea of a route to the West so fascinating. Navigators and their patrons in Europe reason from incomplete maps. They are unaware that a massive continent, which we now call America, lies between Europe and Asia. Some clues, such as the accounts of distant islands or unknown lands cited by rare Nordic adventurers, the Vikings having reached Greenland and possibly the coasts of Newfoundland in the 11th century, are too fragmentary to overthrow the dominant geographical representations. The dream remains that of a relatively short ocean crossing, allowing access to what is then called the Indies, a term encompassing a vast area including present-day India, China, and the islands of Southeast Asia. Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa, probably in 1451, into a family that few of his contemporaries would have considered privileged. Genoa, located in the northwest of present-day Italy, was then a powerful and influential maritime republic. Its strategic position on the Mediterranean Sea favored trade and exchanges with a wide range of regions, from the Near East to Northern Europe. Its port was bustling with activity, and exotic goods passed through it in colossal quantities. In this context, growing up in Genoa meant being immersed in a culture oriented towards navigation and maritime affairs. Young people heard from an early age about distant adventures and treasures brought back from unknown lands, fueling the imagination and ambition of an entire generation. For Columbus, this Genoese effervescence was crucial as it built the foundation of his passion for the sea. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a weaver by trade, although various sources suggest he might have supplemented his income by engaging in small commercial transactions. He likely proceeded with the sale of fabrics, which was not uncommon in a city deeply marked by trade. His mother, named Susanna Fontanarosa, took care of the household and managed the family's daily needs as best as she could. They lived simply, without great means, but also without the extreme poverty that would have prevented any personal development for their children. At the time, Genoa attracted merchants, navigators, and artisans from various backgrounds, and the Colombo family was part of this mixed picture where perseverance and hard work could open up modest but encouraging opportunities. The young Christopher, like many other children in Genoa, grew up in an environment where commercial transactions, new maritime routes, and nautical charts were frequently discussed. Galleys and caravels headed for the ports of the Levant or Northern Europe regularly left the harbor, loaded with precious goods. Discussions thrived about the profits to be made from the trade of spices, fine fabrics, or gold. This ambitious atmosphere shaped the curiosity of the future explorer. Although his family did not belong to the high aristocracy or the major Genoese merchant bourgeoisie, it was enough to provide him with the means to listen, observe, and learn from those who had traveled the Mediterranean. Passing minstrels or sailors told fabulous adventures, distant islands, and exotic lands, spiced with romanticized details. For Christopher, these tales were true windows onto an unknown world yet to be explored. As he grew up, Columbus received a fairly basic education, corresponding to what a Genoese artisan family of the time could offer. It is estimated that he learned the basics of writing and arithmetic, essential skills for anyone wishing to navigate or trade. He did not receive the learned education reserved for the most affluent elites, but he quickly developed a keen interest in maritime activities and cartography. The mechanisms of commerce required mastery of accounting, currency conversions, and reading nautical information. Thus, without having a very advanced formal education, he was able to acquire practical knowledge in geography and arithmetic, useful for navigation and trade. In his childhood, it seems he was not destined to become a leading adventurer, but his natural curiosity and the Genoese excitement were already preparing him for his future vocation. The city of Genoa was renowned for its ship owners and its vast network of commercial relations, which extended from the Black Sea to the Atlantic. This environment offered motivated young people the opportunity to board merchant ships to accumulate experience and fortune. It is not surprising that as a teenager, Columbus sought to embark and see these distant horizons up close. The port exchanges, the ships at the quay, and the sailors recounting their campaigns awakened in him a deep desire for exploration. He discovered at that time that navigation was not only a matter of courage or strength, but also technical knowledge, reading the winds, interpreting the stars, calculating latitudes, anticipating storms. The art of navigation in the 15th century relied on relatively rudimentary tools, such as the astrolabe, the compass, and an embryonic cartography. Yet, for a mind eager for discoveries, it was a fascinating field of study. The tales of Marco Polo, a 13th century Venetian traveler, still had a considerable influence on minds in search of mysterious lands. The publication of Polo's adventures, describing the fabulous riches of Asia, had fueled the imagination of many Europeans. Columbus, whose culture was tinged with this Genoese fascination for the sea and trade routes, was undoubtedly captivated by the idea of discovering this exotic world recounted by Polo. Even if he did not master Latin expertly, he might have heard excerpts of these tales or read popular translations. The treasures, the spices, the brilliant cities, and the splendors of the Orient mentioned by the Venetian abounded in the conversations of merchants. Such stories encouraged the belief that beyond the oceans lay bountiful territories, capable of offering gigantic commercial opportunities. During his adolescence, Columbus seems to have started embarking on merchant ships. His first maritime experiences, according to some accounts, led him to sail the Mediterranean, including the area of the Aegean Sea and the vicinity of Asia Minor. Although the sources from this period remain fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, it is known that at 16 or 17 years old, he had already served as a cabin boy, then as a sailor, thereby gaining practical expertise. Quickly adapting to life aboard and enduring the hardships faced at sea became necessary qualities in order to pursue his projects. Working alongside experienced navigators, Columbus absorbed knowledge that was not taught in books, such as managing sails in contrary winds, maneuvering perilously in bad weather, and techniques for coasting near shorelines. Gradually, his interest in cartography and astronomy only grew. Each of his journeys was an opportunity to study new maps and refine his navigation skills. Navigators of the 15th century mostly relied on sea charts, or portolans, which detailed the coasts with some degree of accuracy, while the interiors of lands often remained unknown. These documents, sometimes deriving from the legacy of ancient Arab or Italian cartographers, held strategic importance for guiding navigation. Columbus, naturally curious, constantly sought to compare what he observed during his voyages with the cartographic documents he had the chance to consult. His discussions with Genoese and Portuguese cartographers, the latter renowned for their advancement in mapping coastlines and measuring distances at sea, helped him lay the foundation for his future geographical concepts. Some authors suggest that during his youth, Columbus might have led expeditions to Iceland, or sometimes mentioned as going to the African archipelagos, notably Guinea, on the western coast. However, the reliability of these accounts remains controversial, as the records from the time are patchy, and the information reported by Columbus himself in his later writings is not always consistent. Despite the historical uncertainty, it is plausible that he ventured north to the vicinity of Iceland, known at the time for its cold waters and remote location. This rumor is partly explained by the allure of QD fishing in the North Atlantic, a valuable resource for many sailors from Western Europe. As for the region of Guinea, further south, it represented that African gateway through which gold, ivory, and some exotic goods transited. The Portuguese, very active on the African coast, already conducted commercial and cartographic exploration expeditions there. If it is true that Columbus took part in this type of journey, he might have, on that occasion, learned about the Atlantic currents and understood the navigation routes along Africa. In any case, these hypothetical expeditions beyond the Mediterranean greatly enhanced the expertise of the young Genoese. He refined his observational skills and understood how trade winds, those steady winds blowing in the Atlantic, could become precious allies for venturing out to sea and returning to port bases. With each journey, he gained maturity, perfected his negotiation skills with crews, chart experts, and merchants he met at distant ports of call. It is likely that his motivations gradually evolved. Initially centered on the simple desire to discover new horizons, he began to harbor a certain ambition to find a previously unknown sea route that would guarantee glory and wealth. The idea of reaching the Indies by crossing the Atlantic was largely based on ancient works, notably those of the Greek geographer Claudius Ptolemy, who lived in the 2nd century AD. Ptolemy described the Earth as a sphere while proposing an estimation of its extent in his Geography. In the Middle Ages, most Christian scholars also considered the Earth to be round, relying on various theological or philosophical arguments. Nevertheless, the question of the planet's dimensions was still subject to debate. By the late 15th century, there were notable divergences in the calculation of the Earth's circumference. Some maps represented a globe less vast than it was in reality, while others exaggerated distances that discouraged any desire to venture into the unknown. Columbus, for his part, relied on optimistic estimates that led him to believe that crossing the Atlantic westward would be shorter and more accessible than imagined. His deep conviction that one could more easily reach the Asian lands by sailing directly west was largely due to an underestimation of the Earth's circumference. It seems that he was partially based on calculations from the works of an Arab geographer, Alfraganus, known in Latin Europe as Alfragan, who had provided measurements that could be misunderstood by Westerners. Moreover, Columbus interpreted the available longitudes and maps in his own way, sometimes minimizing the distance in favor of his own intuitions. By assuming a reduced size of the Atlantic, it theoretically became conceivable in his mind to access the fabulous riches of the Orient without taking the land route or circumventing Africa by the south. This belief was a decisive factor in his obstinacy. Convinced that the journey was not insurmountable, Columbus was determined to organize an expedition, despite the prevailing doubts and skepticism. With this idea in mind, Columbus immediately sought to obtain the support of powers capable of financing him. In the 15th century, Portugal, Castile, and Aragon, future pillars of unified Spain, England, and France, were among the great rival European monarchies, often engaged in wars of succession or struggles for influence. At the maritime level, Portugal stood out as the most advanced nation in the exploration of the Atlantic and African coasts. Under the impetus of Prince Henry the Navigator, who died a few decades earlier. Portuguese navigators had made major advancements in cartography, astronomy, and the design of lighter, more maneuverable ships, like the caravel. Thus, in the mid-1480s, Columbus naturally turned first to the Portuguese court to present his plan. Instead of continuing exploration southward, he proposed to attempt the westward crossing of the Atlantic, convinced that Asia was within sail reach. However, the King of Portugal, John II, had already invested heavily in the African exploration. Portuguese navigators were gradually advancing along the western coasts of Africa, setting up trading posts, exchanging goods, and inching closer, they thought, to the main objective of the East Indies. In this context, the monarch deemed Columbus's theory too uncertain, which also presented a high financial risk. The Genoans' calculations, resting on a distance significantly shorter than the reality, seemed risky to the royal advisors. Furthermore, Portugal did not want to embark on an enterprise that might undermine the enormous effort already made to round the Cape of Good Hope. Thus, despite Columbus's experience as a sailor and cartographer, the project was rejected by the Portuguese court. Faced with this failure, Columbus decided to cross the border to head towards Castile, then governed by the Catholic monarchs Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. These two sovereigns had united their territories through marriage in 1469, creating a solid political base for the nascent Spain, while still remaining distinct in many administrative areas. In the late 1480s and early 1490s, they were primarily focused on the Reconquista War, seeking to progressively reclaim the Iberian Peninsula, still partly under Muslim rule for several centuries. The last Moorish stronghold was the city of Granada, which was firmly resisting the Castilian and Aragonese armies. For this reason, when Columbus presented his project in Spain, he initially encountered indifference or hesitation. The Catholic monarchs had little time and resources to allocate to maritime expeditions as long as their military efforts were incomplete. Nevertheless, the Genoese's persistence, charisma, and tenacity eventually attracted the attention of some of Queen Isabella's advisors. He also sought support from influential members of the court, who saw in this project the potential to execute a grand coup, capable of challenging Portugal's reputation as a maritime power. Negotiations between Columbus and the Castilian crown lasted for years. There were several meetings, official requests, and interviews with learned ecclesiastics tasked with judging the feasibility of the enterprise. The main question remained, was this western route to Asia credible? A complete unknown for most, it raised fears and skepticism. Columbus, for his part, persisted in underestimating the distance, ardently defending his conviction that he would quickly land on the shores of the Far East, perhaps in Japan, then China, or even reaching the Indies of the Great Khan, described in travel narratives circulating in Europe at the time. During this period, several attempts at conciliation failed. The Royal Council, called the Council of Negotiations, highlighted the threats of an unknown ocean, the lack of reliable maps, and the total uncertainty regarding winds and currents off the Atlantic. It was also argued that the already existing potentialities of the southern route, which, as learned, continued to progress thanks to Portuguese expeditions. However, Columbus, supported by some influential backers, refused to be discouraged. His refusal to give up eventually coincided with a major turning point in Iberian history, the fall of Granada. Indeed, on January 6th, after 10 years of conflict, Granada capitulated to the troops of the Catholic monarchs. This military success completed the Reconquista and marked the end of several centuries of Muslim presence in the southern Iberian Peninsula. Suddenly, Spain found itself in a new situation, that of a unified kingdom, proud of its victory and eager to seal its prestige through overseas expansion. The economic recovery, following the end of the conflict, and the desire to rival Portugal on the maritime front now offered a more favorable political and financial context for examining Columbus's project. Queen Isabella, in particular, seemed increasingly receptive to the idea of spreading the Catholic faith in potential new territories, while dreaming of bringing back to Castile treasures comparable to those described in the accounts of Marco Polo, or in geographically vague but very popular legends. Her husband Ferdinand, more cautious, was eventually convinced, appreciating nonetheless that the conditions of the expedition were firmly negotiated to ensure minimal risk for the crown. In April 1492, in the plain of Santa Fe, outside the city of Granada, the final discussions took place on the terms that would bind Columbus and the monarchs. The negotiations resulted in an agreement recorded in a now famous document, the Capitulations of Santa Fe, dated April 17, 1492. In this text, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand granted Columbus significant privileges and official titles in the event of success. The Genoese was to receive the titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor-General of the lands he would discover. He would also be awarded a substantial portion of the potential riches, gold, spices, precious metals, from these territories. Additionally, the Catholic monarchs granted him the right to propose 3 candidates for the position of governor for each new territory, from which the sovereign would choose. A significant percentage, 10% according to the initial agreement, of all the trade proceeds from these future regions was also to be his, a considerable benefit if the route truly led to the riches of Asia. Under the capitulations signed between Columbus and the Crown, local authorities are compelled to provide part of the crew. Several sailors, sometimes not very convinced, are recruited either willingly or by force. Others, however, volunteer, attracted by the promise of personal glory or the hope of bringing back treasures. At the time, recruitment posters promised significant gains and a chance to get rich through the discovery of gold, spices, and other exotic goods. Technical preparations include repairing ships from nearby ports, stocking up on provisions, fresh water, spare sails, and rudimentary navigation equipment. To carry out his project, Columbus has 3 ships, each with a specific role. The largest of them is the Santa Maria, sometimes described as a nau, a ship somewhat sturdier than a caravel, commanded by Columbus himself. The Santa Maria carries most of the provisions, equipment, and commanding crew. Next is the Pinta, a lighter and faster caravel, commanded by Martin Alonso Pinzon. Finally, the Niña, also a caravel, is under the command of Vicente Yáñez Pinzon, the brother of Martin Alonso. These 2 caravels, which are more maneuverable, are meant to explore the shallow waters and recognize the coasts once land is spotted. The 3 ships gather about 90 men, mostly Andalusian sailors used to navigating the nearby Atlantic, especially off the Canary Islands. Alongside them are a few adventurers or outcasts, driven by the quest for the unknown. All these people must endure Spartan living conditions on board. Space is limited, fresh water and provisions are rationed, and every nook is used to store essential goods for a journey that could last several months without certainty. Tensions can quickly arise on such ships. However, the prospect of profiting from potential discoveries keeps part of the crew motivated. Upon the official announcement of the departure, two opposing feelings stir sailors and local residents. On one hand, enthusiasm is fueled by ancient tales of fabulous islands and unknown lands brimming with precious metals and rare spices. A successful venture could make everyone rich. Columbus, as the main navigator, dreams of being admiral of vast territories. Many of the crew hope to enrich themselves and return covered in glory. On the other hand, many fear the crossing of an ocean once believed to be populated by sea monsters or bordering the ends of the earth. The vastness of the Atlantic suggests considerable risks. If contrary winds were to trap the ships, could they even return? This dilemma animates conversations in the port's taverns and around the docks. Should one take part in such an uncertain expedition or stay ashore to continue a safer life, albeit less prosperous? On August 3, 1492, the fleet set sail from Palos de la Frontera. Columbus, hand on the helm of the Santa Maria, leaves the port accompanied by the Pinta and the Niña. The crossing begins with a course set towards the Canary Islands, a territory already controlled by the Crown of Castile. This first stage allows testing the crew's cohesion and preparing for the next part in much more controlled conditions. The ships often benefit from moderate winds in these waters. Stops at the Canaries prove crucial. Repairs are carried out, particularly on the Pinta's rudder, which shows signs of failure, and stocks of fresh food, drinking water, and last-minute provisions are replenished. When the small fleet resumes its journey, it takes advantage of the trade winds, those regular winds blowing from east to west in the North Atlantic. For the navigators, this wind force is as much a blessing as a gamble. While it facilitates progress, it can also complicate the return in the opposite direction. Nevertheless, Columbus relies on these favorable winds to quickly reach the area he imagines to be the eastern part of Asia. In the 15th century, navigation equipment was limited to rudimentary instruments such as the compass and the astrolabe. Sailors also use coastal navigation when sailing in the Mediterranean or along the African coast. However, here, there is no shore in sight for many weeks. To estimate latitude, they consider the angle of the sun's position or that of the North Star. For longitude, however, they are content with an uncertain estimate of the distance traveled and direction. Columbus's records, therefore, have significant margins of error, which explains the constant anxiety among the crew. Daily life on board takes place in close quarters. Columbus's orders are executed by sailors whose confidence may waver over the days. They must repair damaged sails, pump bilge water, and monitor the condition of provisions. Fear crystallizes as they progress westward. No one sees land for several days, then several weeks, and no familiar land is announced on the horizon. However, Columbus is skillful in managing the collective anxiety. He regularly delivers speeches, extolling the proximity of Asian coasts and relying on small signs of hope: floating debris, tree branches, migrating birds. Any presence of trunks or vegetation at sea is interpreted as proof that land is close. Among his strategies, Columbus does not shy away from a few manipulations to avoid frightening his companions. According to a tradition reported by several accounts, he deliberately underreports the number of leagues actually covered in the logbook. Thus, the crew believes they are progressing more slowly and therefore remain within a reasonable navigation range from Europe. As the days go by and the journey drags on, this subterfuge helps maintain morale. The sailors are unaware that they have traveled far more nautical miles than the captain announces. This psychological trick, coupled with the encouraging observations he shares whenever he perceives the slightest sign of proximity to land, maintains hope and prevents mutiny. long-anticipated moment arrives on the night of October 11th, 1492. Watchmen claim to see a shoreline on the horizon. At dawn, Columbus orders the anchor dropped near the island that the locals call Guanahani. He himself names it San Salvador, convinced he has reached an insular zone close to Asia or India. In reality, this island is part of the Bahamas archipelago, east of Florida. The shockwave is immense. After more than 2 months at sea, the crew finally lands on a land unknown to Europeans. Emotion peaks when Columbus plants the royal standard, officially claiming the island, as per the instructions of the Catholic monarchs. The sailors, initially incredulous, are overcome with joy. Many kneel and kiss the sand in gratitude for having survived a crossing many deemed impossible. Columbus, on the other hand, savors what he considers the first step of a great discovery. He believes he has proven the accuracy of his theory that one can reach Asia by heading west, even though he completely underestimates the extent of the American continent that lies in between. Upon arriving, Columbus and his companions meet the island's inhabitants, now known as the Taínos. The initial encounters exchange courteous gestures and curious glances. The Taínos do not understand the visitors' language, but observe their clothing, weapons, and ornaments. On their part, the Spaniards offer trinkets such as glass beads or bells, hoping to receive gold or spices in return. The astonishment is mutual. The Taínos have never seen caravels or men coming from across the ocean, while the Spaniards quickly convince themselves that part of the population could lead them to opulent kingdoms. Columbus, convinced he is in the hinterlands of the Indies, names the inhabitants Indios, a term that will become widespread to designate the native peoples of the American continent. At the time, however, there is no idea that they are dealing with a new continent. The erroneous maps and calculations reinforce the confusion. Columbus believes he is approaching the large islands of Asia described by Marco Polo, without realizing he is still very far from the real Asian coasts. Encouraged by this initial success, Columbus decides to continue exploration around. He sets course to the south and west, discovering other islands, including Cuba. Convinced it might be an Asian peninsula, he examines the terrain and observes the lush vegetation, hoping to find large cities or trading ports. His observations, however, are hindered by the absence of valuable spices and a lack of precise information about any local empire. After Cuba, he reaches Hispaniola, the island that corresponds today to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There, he notices a larger population and promising natural resources. Encounters with the Taínos are generally peaceful at first, though cultural misunderstanding remains strong, especially regarding bartering and the respective value of exchanged items. On December 24, 1492, a dramatic event challenges the organization of the expedition. The Santa María, Columbus's flagship, runs aground on a sandbank north of Hispaniola. Approaching the coast at night without solid landmarks, the crew mishandles the maneuver, and the ship partially breaks apart. The sailors then have to evacuate urgently. Columbus quickly realizes he will not be able to refloat the Santa María. He resigns to recover what can be salvaged of the supplies and wood, but the ship is irretrievably lost. Faced with this situation, and unable to bring everyone back to Spain with only 2 caravels remaining, Columbus decides to leave part of his men on site. He orders the construction of a small fort named La Navidad, in reference to the accident occurring on Christmas night. The Taínos of Hispaniola, led by a local cacique, provide logistical support, whether it be provisions or help in building the fortified structure. Columbus hopes to make it the first Spanish foothold on what he thinks are the Asian fringes, and, thus, demonstrate to the rulers of Castile and Aragon the possibility of establishing a permanent colony in the Indies. After supervising the installation of his men in the fort of La Navidad, Columbus must consider returning to Europe to report his discovery. He only has the Niña and the Pinta available for the crossing. At the beginning of 1493, he sets the two caravels eastward, without any certainty that the winds will be favorable for crossing the Atlantic again. This time, he can no longer rely on the tailwinds. He must navigate further north, encountering opposing winds, and then opt for a drift, allowing him to reach the Iberian Peninsula. During the crossing, storms and violent winds severely test the sailors and ships. Along the way, the ships are separated by a storm. The Niña, where Columbus is, struggling to stay on course, eventually makes it to Spain just barely. The Pinta, on the other hand, arrives a few days later. Despite these ordeals, both caravels finally reach the port of Bayona in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, and then the port of Palos de la Frontera. It is on March 15th, 1493, that Columbus steps onto Spanish soil again, completing a journey that began more than 7 months earlier. Upon his arrival, Columbus was no longer just an idealistic sailor. He was the discoverer of a new world, even if he himself was still mistaken about the precise nature of his discoveries. In the holds of the Niña and the Pinta, he brought back various exotic items, some samples of gold, and especially a few Taino individuals. Their presence aroused the curiosity of the Spanish court and nobility. Their presence in Europe, a first, was impressive as a living illustration of territories hitherto unknown. The spoils were modest compared to the initial dreams of fabulous wealth and abundant spices, but they were enough to establish the credibility of the account. The news quickly spread through the Andalusian valleys and soon throughout Europe. Christopher Columbus had supposedly reached the Indies by an unprecedented route. Dubbed Admiral of the Ocean Sea, thanks to the agreements made before his departure, he saw this title confirmed and received, in addition, the assurance of significant privileges. Acclaimed by the people, courted by high society, Columbus was elevated to the rank of national hero by the Spanish monarchy. The Catholic monarchs hailed his success and encouraged him to prepare new expeditions. His reputation soared to such an extent that some contemporaries already saw Columbus as the providential man who would offer Spain supremacy over the trade routes connecting Europe to an imagined now close by Far East. Buoyed by the recognition he gained in Spain after his first voyage, Christopher Columbus embarked in September 1493 on a new journey with significantly broader stakes. This second expedition, spanning from 1493 to 1496, was designed to consolidate previous discoveries and establish a lasting Spanish presence in the islands he visited during his first trip. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, this time allocated substantial resources to turn the newly reached territories into viable colonies. In total, 17 ships were mobilized, ready to set sail from Cadiz, a major trading port in Andalusia. The crew was estimated at about 1,200 men, a colossal contingent at the time, which included not only sailors but also craftsmen, soldiers, and even clergy. All were driven by the hope of finding gold, spices, and riches that could enhance the power of the Kingdom of Spain. In Columbus's mind, another crucial objective remained: to continue the search for new routes to Asia, as he was still convinced that the islands encountered formed the eastern outpost of the Asian continent. The departure of this impressive flotilla took place on September 25, 1493. Unlike his first journey, where Columbus sailed with only 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, he now commanded a true armada. The atmosphere was very different. While the first crossing was a risky venture fraught with doubts, this second voyage was driven by a sense of urgency and national enthusiasm. Spain wanted to solidify its lead over Portugal, which had been very active on African coasts for several decades. The ships carried a wide range of provisions, food supplies, livestock, seeds, and tools intended for the establishment of permanent settlements. But the equipment also included weapons, as the accounts from the first expedition reported peaceful local populations, while leaving the idea that some might be more hostile. Columbus himself was filled with the pride of founding, on behalf of the crown, the first embryos of a colonial empire in these lands. He still called the Indies. After several weeks at sea, the expedition arrives in November 1493 at the archipelago where Columbus had already set foot a year earlier. The Portuguese generally refer to it as Antillas on their maps, while Columbus sees it as the coast of the East Indies. He quickly spots the island he names Dominica before proceeding to Marie-Galante and Guadeloupe, names he gives in homage to various Spanish monasteries and patrons. The explorers make stops to resupply, observe the local fauna and flora, and establish the first contacts with the natives. On each new island, they erect crosses and proclaim the sovereignty of the Spanish monarchy. However, the main objective of this second voyage remains colonization, creating settlements capable of extracting valuable resources from the region. To this end, Columbus founds La Isabella on the northern coast of the island of Hispaniola, present-day Dominican Republic. It is the very first European city in the New World, named after Queen Isabella of Castile. While the creation of La Isabella represents a strong symbol of conquest, the city quickly faces many challenges. The colonists, unaccustomed to the tropical climate, suffer from diseases and a shortage of drinking water. Relations with the local populations, initially cordial, become strained when the Spaniards begin to demand a tribute in gold. The Taínos, the indigenous people who have long inhabited the island of Hispaniola, have never accumulated significant reserves of gold. For them, the yellow metal is not an essential element of their economic or social organization. Disappointed and fearing indigenous resistance, the colonists often react violently. Furthermore, the actual search for spices like the much-coveted cinnamon or pepper proves fruitless on these islands. Consequently, the prospect of fabulous wealth fades, and the initial enthusiasm gives way to misunderstanding and frustration. Nevertheless, the second voyage is not devoid of new discoveries. It is during this period that Columbus spots Jamaica in 1494 and anchors in what will become Puerto Rico. Jamaica, an island with lush landscapes, sparks strong interest for its agricultural potential, but it also does not offer the treasures hoped for. In Puerto Rico, Columbus makes cautious initial contact with other indigenous peoples, already shaken by the shock of strangers arriving from the sea. Despite the disappointments related to the lack of gold, the exploration continues, fueled by the persistent idea that there must be a richer land a little further to the west. However, the fleet disperses and weakens logistically, ensuring the sustenance of hundreds of men on islands with limited resources is extremely complex. Internal tensions arise, isolated mutinies and conflicts between officers testify to the growing climate of uncertainty. In 1496, Columbus returns to Spain to report on the results of this second expedition. Although some treasures, samples of exotic plants and new animals are presented to the court, the outcome does not completely satisfy the Catholic monarchs, who expected much more substantial riches. Critical voices begin to rise. Columbus is reproached for his stubborn insistence that he has reached the fringes of Asia and his authoritarian management style. Nevertheless, the crown remains determined to continue the enterprise, as the maritime rivalry with Portugal does not justify abandoning the territories barely colonized. Despite the growing criticisms, exploration continues. It is in this contrasting mindset that Columbus prepares his third voyage, undertaken from 1498 to 1500. The third voyage, which begins in 1498, is marked by Columbus's desire to explore more southern latitudes in the Atlantic. He has fewer ships than on the second voyage, but the goal remains the same: to strengthen existing colonies and finally find the infamous Asian riches he still believes are within reach. It is during this expedition that the explorer reaches the island of Trinidad before sailing along the coast of Venezuela in South America. Between the mouths of the Orinoco and the discovery of an unknown coastline, Columbus realizes he is facing a vast territory. However, he does not formally recognize that it is a new continent. True to his original hypothesis, he perceives these lands as an extension of Asia, without fully understanding that he has approached a vast continent unknown to Europeans. However, the situation quickly deteriorates in Hispaniola, where Columbus left settlers and brothers in command positions. The Spaniards on site, frustrated by the low gold yield and the harsh living conditions, revolt against the authority of the Columbus family. The indigenous populations, increasingly subjected to forced labor and mistreatment, try to resist but face violent reprisals. The colony, supposed to bring glory and prosperity, sinks into political chaos and mismanagement. Rumors of tyranny reach the court of Spain, to the point that the monarchy sends an official representative, Francisco de Bobadilla, to investigate the accusations against Columbus and his brothers. In 1500, the latter is arrested and sent back to Spain in chains, a humiliating episode for someone who, a few years earlier, was acclaimed as a national hero. Despite this disgrace, Columbus hasn't completely lost the trust of the sovereigns. After being released and heard by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, he is granted permission to attempt a fourth voyage, loyal to his obsession, to prove that a sea route to Asia via the west indeed exists. Thus, in 1502, he sets sail again with a more modest flotilla than during the second voyage, but still sufficiently equipped to undertake a substantial exploration. His plan is to sail further south in order to circumvent what he believes to be large islands and discover a strait that would allow him to reach the Indian Ocean. During this fourth voyage, which ends in 1504, Columbus sails along Central America, crossing Honduras, Costa Rica, and Panama. He hopes to find a marine passage, a strait that would lead directly to the Asian territories, described by Marco Polo. Alas, the geographical reality does not meet his expectations. The harsh tropical climates, the monsoon, and tropical storms severely damage several of his ships. Moreover, relations with some local populations are tense. He surrounds himself with a few indigenous guides, but increasingly struggles to resupply. Provisions are scarce, and the crew, weary of fruitless explorations, sees these humid forests and inhospitable coasts as a dead end. Columbus eventually shipwrecks on the shores of Jamaica in 1503, gripped by illness and discouragement. The survival of the crew in Jamaica becomes a pressing issue. The Taino inhabitants, already wary of foreigners, hesitate to provide them with enough food to subsist. Knowing time is running out and having no ship fit to sail, Columbus relies on his knowledge of astronomy to orchestrate a memorable ruse. He consults his ephemerides, a kind of astronomical calendar much prized by navigators, and anticipates an imminent lunar eclipse. In February 1504, he gathers the Taino chiefs and announces to them that his god is angry for not receiving the help and food that the Spaniards so desperately need, and as a sign of displeasure, the moon will soon be darkened. When the eclipse occurs, the inhabitants, fearing a divine punishment, hurry to supply Columbus and his men. This stratagem, both ingenious and manipulative, allows him to prolong their survival until help can arrive from Hispaniola. Finally, Columbus manages to leave Jamaica and returns to Spain in November 1504. He is then aged, tired, and his prestige has considerably eroded. Nevertheless, these successive voyages have expanded European knowledge of territories hitherto absent from official maps. They have especially highlighted the existence of lands far larger than simple islands, even if Columbus, until the end, obstinately believed he had reached the fringes of Asia. Neither did his explorations lead him to discover a passage to the spices, nor did the objectives of rapid enrichment fully materialize. But the geopolitical importance of these explorations in the Caribbean and the coasts of Central America is already palpable. They serve as a starting point for the massive conquest and colonization that will follow. In the wake of the Jamaican escapades and the successive voyages from 1493 to 1504, a new chapter of world history is opening, in which other conquistadors will take over, convinced that beyond these islands and meager quantities of gold lie opulent civilizations and empires to conquer. Faint glimmers of reality are already emerging. The unknown continent is immensely larger and more complex than anything imagined in Europe. The gradual decline of Christopher Columbus began even as his expeditions had made him famous throughout the Kingdom of Spain and beyond. After his fourth and final voyage, completed in 1504, he faced a series of setbacks that tarnished his reputation and undermined his health. Several factors contributed to this downfall. First, the Spanish crown's disenchantment with the absence of the immense treasures they had hoped for, then the growing number of complaints from settlers in the Western Indies, and finally, the political and personal rivalries that intensified. To understand these tensions, one must know that Columbus had obtained, through the Capitulations of Santa Fe in 1492, prestigious titles of governor and viceroy over the discovered lands, as well as shares in the future riches. His detractors blamed him for disastrous management and accused him of authoritarianism. They also accused him of using violence to maintain power in the colonies, particularly in Hispaniola, the island that today houses Haiti and the Dominican Republic. These accusations, coupled with the relative failure to find gold and spices, were enough to fuel the idea that Columbus had not fulfilled his initial promises. As complaints multiplied, the Spanish crown began to doubt Columbus's ability to pacify and administer the newly occupied territories. His titles and privileges were then called into question. By the end of the third voyage, around 1500, a representative of the royalty, Francisco de Bobadilla, had already decided to have him arrested and sent back to the Iberian Peninsula. Although he was eventually released, this arrest permanently tainted his aura. Returning from the fourth voyage, Columbus encountered an atmosphere of mistrust. The sovereigns understood that the explorer, still wrapped in glory, remained popular with the public, but they wished to regain control of the colonies without suffering his financial demands or legal claims. The ensuing trials and negotiations mainly focused on the nature and extent of the rights Columbus could claim. He vainly attempted to secure full recognition of his privileges, justifying that he was the discoverer, thanks to whom Spain had been able to establish a foothold in these new territories. While battling to defend his rank and titles, Columbus's health was declining. There were reports of arthritic crises, excruciating joint pains, and possible vision problems, symptoms that worsened with age. The physical constraints of navigation and governance of a nascent empire further weakened him. In his letters, he complained of constant suffering. They depict a man tired, overwhelmed by the colossal weight of his past ambitions and present troubles. This physical malaise was reinforced by a declining morale. Columbus gradually saw his dream of glory crumbling, while new actors, other navigators, and administrators took charge in the Antilles and the American continent. Far from the zeal of his early voyages, the old admiral gradually withdrew from the public scene, hoping that they would eventually restore to him the status he once held. Christopher Columbus finally died on May 20, 1506, in Valladolid, a city in northwestern Spain. He passed away in relative isolation, supported by a few loyalists, but without the splendor he had long desired. The last hours of his life remain shrouded in legend. It is sometimes said that he was convinced until the end that he had reached Asia, and that his discoveries were just the tip of a fabulous Eastern empire. Other accounts suggest that he had come to accept, at least in part, the idea of a new continent. But the reality remains difficult to discern, as few first-hand documents provide precise information about his state of mind at the very end of his days. The New World was named America rather than Columbia, due to Amerigo Vespucci's role in recognizing the continent as a land distinct from Asia. Unlike Christopher Columbus, who believed he had reached the Indies, Vespucci claimed it was a new continent after his explorations of the South American coasts between 1499 and 1502. In 1507, the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller published a world map in which he named the New World America in honor of Amerigo Vespucci. He believed Vespucci was the first to have demonstrated that these lands were not part of Asia, but constituted a distinct continent. Columbus, on the other hand, remained convinced that he had reached the Indies, and thus never identified his discoveries as a new continent. This is why his name was not chosen to designate these lands. However, his legacy persists through names like Columbia or British Columbia, attributed later in his honor. After his death, his body became the subject of a tormented posthumous fate, symbolic of his turbulent history. Initially buried in Valladolid, Columbus was transferred to the monastery of La Cartuja near Seville a few years later. But the journey of his remains did not stop there. His heirs demanded that he rest in the territories he had discovered. In 1542, his bones were sent to Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola, where they remained for more than 2 centuries in the city's cathedral. When the island came under French control in 1795, Spain ensured the transfer of his coffin to Cuba, so it would not fall into foreign hands. Finally, at the end of the 19th century, when Spain was expelled from Cuba during the Spanish-American War in 1898, the presumed remains of Columbus were repatriated to Seville, in the cathedral where a mausoleum is now dedicated to him. This long journey raises questions. Some feel that the remains, moved numerous times, were not always the correct ones. Recent analyses have been conducted to try to authenticate those resting in Seville, while in the Dominican Republic, it is also claimed that Columbus's true remains are still in the cathedral of the capital. Thus, a debate without definitive conclusion is born and persists, fueling fascination around the figure. If the seas carry his relics, they also carry the immense legacy of his discoveries from the end of the 15th century. The immediate consequence of Columbus's voyages is the opening of a new continent to European conquest. Within a few short years, the crowns of Spain and Portugal sent other expeditions, while France and England also began to take an interest in these distant territories. Rapidly, exploration gave way to colonization, permanent settlements, exploitation of resources, and the establishment of systems of domination. This acceleration reflects not only Europe's appetite for gold and exotic commodities, but also the ambition to spread the Catholic faith in an evangelical mission spirit largely supported by the Iberian sovereigns. A whole transatlantic network then emerges, and exchanges go far beyond mere material wealth. Historians call the Columbian Exchange the vast phenomenon of interaction between the Old World, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the New World, the Americas. In the years following 1492, plants, animals, and even viruses and bacteria circulated massively. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and cocoa arrived in Europe, where they gradually changed dietary habits. Conversely, wheat, vines, horses, and European cattle were introduced in the Americas, disrupting local agriculture and lifestyles. Unfortunately, diseases previously unknown in America, such as smallpox or measles, decimated large fractions of the indigenous peoples whose bodies were not prepared to resist such plagues. This often dramatic biological exchange was accompanied by a complex cultural exchange, where European cosmologies and the religious or social practices of indigenous peoples clashed. Alongside these phenomena, the issue of subjugation quickly arises. As the settlers exploit gold and the nascent plantations, they enslave part of the indigenous populations, accused of refusing Spanish authority or considered as not having the true faith. When the local workforce proves insufficient or is decimated by diseases, the slavery system gradually turns toward populations from Africa, thus initiating the transatlantic slave trade, which will have enormous demographic, economic, and cultural consequences on several continents. Columbus's legacy, in this perspective, takes on a deeply contradictory dimension. On one hand, he enabled the contact between two worlds that were ignorant of each other. On the other, he paved the way for centuries of brutal domination and suffering for the local populations. Moreover, there is the question of the authorship of the discoveries. It is sometimes pointed out that Norse sailors, the Vikings, set foot in America 5 centuries before Columbus, or that other Asian or African navigators might have reached the American coasts long before 1492. However, the global impact of his arrival in the Caribbean is beyond dispute. He initiated large-scale permanent maritime routes between two worlds, forever altering the history of human societies.